It's my pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker, Tanya Hosch, the General Manager of Inclusion and Social Policy at the AFL. Tanya was due to speak earlier this year in this Rotary year, but the new Minister for Indigenous Affairs and Indigenous Australians called her to Canberra, where Ken Wyatt announced, amongst other things, a referendum on Indigenous constitutional recognition, fellas, within 3 years. Given that Tanya was a member of the referendum council that led to the process and final recommendation, resulting in the statement from the heart in May 2017, I can only guess that we can understand that her priorities that day were elsewhere. Interestingly, Tanya was in Melbourne yesterday, came home last night, a brief visit to her home, and particularly to be with us today for lunch. And promptly at 2 o'clock, she'll be on a plane back to Melbourne for a big function tonight, so it's pretty good work. I asked Tanya to speak when meeting at the launch of the GFG sponsorship at a football ground quite close, down around Alberton Way, earlier this year. Diversity and inclusion had come to the Rotary lexicon, and it was important to hear from a leader in the field. For some in the community, these are just words that roll off the tongue. For others, they represent a powerful community that are not just words. Sorry. Bloody phone. It's on silent. Okay. I told him not to ring me at the office. All right. But for others, it represents an incredibly powerful future. And for some of us, diversity and inclusion are just what we do or how we feel. I first learnt about diversity and inclusion in the Railway Town Primary School playground at lunchtime. Broken Hill was the melting pot in the 50s, well before that term became used or indeed popular at the time, or for a time. My schoolmates came from a host of exotic sounding places, including Wilcannia and Tibooburra and all places in the Baltic states and so on. And this was amply demonstrated by the lunch fare offered by the respective families of my fellow little tankers. Many were happy to swap their delicious salami and tasty cheese, which you can see I've acquired a taste for, with my jam sandwich. That's inclusion, that's diversity. We shared food, stories and a life that was truly inclusive, even on the soccer pitch playing for Naprana, the local Yugoslav team. But I digress again. To share with us some of her thoughts, views and visions, please welcome Tanya Hosch.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I said I'm Tanya Hosch. I do live in Adelaide, but don't spend anywhere near enough time here. For those of you who noticed, I'm also wearing a red skirt, but I won't be dancing. And that's a very hard act to follow. That was lovely and quite special, nice surprise. So I work at the AFL. This time of year, I get a lot of phone calls. So if you've seen me playing on my phone, it's to do with all the ticket requests that come in from people that we like to call September friends. Not quite into September yet, but the finals fixture for week 1 is out, and so my phone has started to buzz. And if I don't deal with them quickly, I do forget, and then they do block up, and then I'm in trouble with all these people that I only hear from once a year. So I was asked to come and talk about what my role is at the AFL. My role didn't exist until I went into it. It was a role that Gillan McLaughlin offered me after me working with him when I was working on constitutional change through the Recognised campaign. And it's a much broader role than just dealing with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander issues. I deal with gender, multiculturalism, racism, sexism, disability, transgender, and also lesbian, gay, transgender, intersex, asexuality. So who would have thought that this brown chick from Adelaide would end up in a job at the biggest sporting code in the country, having some pretty interesting conversations with very traditional and passionate football supporters. I have to say that when I started, the most common question I got was, oh, it must be very blokey in there. Must be a lot of men that work in the business. Well, yes, that's true. There is a lot of men. But I started just on the eve of the Women's League starting. So I was very fortunate to come into the business at a time when there was a big focus on women's football and getting that all started off. And for those of you that missed the women's grand final at this very ground, earlier this year, you really missed something special. It was a fabulous day with, 53,000 people here, or more than that in fact, which is more than some of the men's games got this year. I was always confident that if the grand final was held at this ground that Adelaide would be out in force to support the Women's League, and I was very smug about proving myself right. It was a great day. So in terms of talking about what inclusion and diversity means, let me tell you a bit about myself. So I was conceived in Melbourne and born in Adelaide. My natural mother is from Wales and my natural father a Torres Strait Islander, and then when I was 3 weeks old I was adopted into a family with an Aboriginal father from New South Wales and a white mother. So I am pretty diverse myself, as it turns out, and just sort of accidentally fell into that kind of work. When I left high school, I went to Enfield High, which doesn't exist anymore, but found myself as a trainee in the State Public Service. My first job was paying the petrol account for the South Australian Police Force. I was terrible at it, and I can't say that the job intrigued me very much. Anyway, from there I found other opportunities inside the State Public Service and really started to build on what my passions were. By the time I was in my early 20s, I was working for a service that is still really important and exists today, called the Women's Information Service. It was, when I was there, the Women's Information Switchboard. That's when I got my education about women's rights and what it meant to be a feminist, and I was quickly inducted, not quite as formally as Adro just did with you, Tim, but I was inducted nonetheless, and started going to university studying a Bachelor of Social Work. So I think it's fair to say that I had a bee in my bonnet about what I considered to be fair, what I considered to be just, and what my own life experience had taught me about what it's like to experience discrimination and what it's like to not feel like you fit into the room. So as my life has gone on, I've stayed in the fields of women's issues, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander affairs, and that has occupied the majority of my career. I'm much older than I look, or at least I like to think so. So I have been in the workforce for over 30 years. I suppose finding myself at the AFL, and I have to say I love footy. I have always loved footy. I grew up in Adelaide, I still live here, so in the Sandful we were Red Leg supporters. Which is why, Peter, I could never really be a Port Adelaide supporter, because it goes deep. I'm married to one. Anyway, goodness, there's a lot of booing, and it seems hasn't quite got over the finals for this year. If it makes you feel any better, I'm a Sydney Swan supporter and we're out of the finals for the first time in 10 years, so I'm not too pleased about that either. I always love football, and the thing about football is it does bring people from all walks of life together. We just released our figures for this year in terms of attendance at games, so this isn't the broadcast figures, this is just people at games, and we're nearly at 7 million people coming to the football just in the minor rounds, so we don't count the finals. That's an increase of 56,500 from last year. So when you think about the fact that, particularly if you're a family, it's not necessarily cheap to come to the football. If you think about the fact that people are very time poor these days also, that's how many Australians still want to be at Aussie Rules football. In fact, last year we broke the record for membership, so that means that at least 1 in every 25 Australians is a paid member of a football club. So for someone who's passionate about social change, you could not ask for a better platform. You're getting to reach a huge number of Australians, and a number of Australians who wouldn't traditionally think as a football as a vehicle for social change, but nonetheless that's what it's become. I do wonder how many of you realise that Australian rules football was the first sporting code in the world to have a racial vilification policy. Not many people know that, but you all seem to be nodding, so excuse me, sorry, I made an assumption. Things don't stay the same, and many years after the original policy was established, it was called Rule 30. It became Rule 35 because it became clear that there were other forms of discrimination that needed to be dealt with on the sporting field. What we say at the AFL is that we're a game for everyone, and so that's what we're in the business of trying to be, a game for everyone. And that means that people to come to the football, to play football, to work in football, to make it as inclusive as possible. And so that means that we need to have systems and procedures in place that make it really easy for people to have conversations about these sorts of things, particularly if you're one of those people that don't always feel included. I've been at the AFL 3 years this week. I was the second woman ever appointed to the AFL executive and the first Indigenous person ever, and that was only 3 years ago. And what I do know to be true, that just because I'm sitting around the table, there are conversations that we have that perhaps we might not have. That might also mean that people think twice before they speak about what they might like to say because there's a brown woman in the room, but that's a good thing, because what we're trying to do is work together and collaborate in a way that is mutually respectful and helps make us better and take us forward. As I said to Gil McLaughlin once, if the idea of me being here is to conform to the way that everyone else thinks and behaves and speaks and dresses, I'm not getting into a check shirt and a pair of chinos anytime soon, I can tell you. It's just really window dressing, it's not real diversity and it's not real inclusion. So for better or for worse, I speak my mind, and that's what I'm there to do. Now sometimes that means that you say things that make things difficult. You ask for things to be done in a different way. You ask for some different considerations to be tabled, to think, okay, well how would we do that differently to make it more inclusive? So some examples perhaps. One of the things that I know for certain, if you want real inclusion and diversity to permeate throughout your organisation, it's really important that that diversity is evident at your decision-making levels. So when I started, of 18 football clubs, there was only one that had an Aboriginal board member. Only one. Now if you think that we're 3% of the population, and we've been so good at this game for a really long time, even, not me, but, my brethren, I suppose, and the sisterhood, increasingly, which is one of the reasons that this game just makes Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people so proud, because we see our people out there just killing it week in, week out. It's the reason I fell in love with football, because when I was a kid, it's the only time I ever heard Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people cheered for and supported, and other than that, most references were quite negative. So that's how I became a real devotee of footy, because it was a place where we could be excellent and I could see people that resembled me being cheered for and supported actively. So one of the first things I realised was it was going to be really important, if I was going to help increase the inclusion and diversity of football clubs, we really needed to ask some questions about the composition of football club boards. Now these are really prestigious positions, they're handed down through generations of family who've dedicated themselves to their clubs, and as Rotarians I'm sure you have a real understanding and respect for tradition and culture and your heritage and all the things that you want to keep solid and continue to honour, as well as those things that you think, okay, we might need to mix some things up, otherwise we might find ourselves starting to shrivel because we're no longer relevant. And so it's a delicate balance, and I'm sure that these are conversations that you have also. So I've made this position pretty clear, and at the moment there are, I'm trying to think, so Gold Coast Suns were the club that had the existing Aboriginal board member. Samantha Riley, the Olympic swimmer, do you remember her? Yeah, she's an Aboriginal woman. And then Collingwood were next, a wonderful woman called Jodie Sizer. Quickly followed, Fremantle were next. So Fremantle have Professor Colleen Hayward, then Collingwood, and I sort of felt like if I could get Eddie, I could get everyone. So, the Reconciliation Action Plan Committee chair was the obvious person, and Eddie was so dedicated to getting Jodie into this position. She is a CEO of PricewaterhouseCoopers Indigenous Consulting, and PricewaterhouseCoopers do the books of Collingwood. So we actually had to sack the auditor in order to get her onto the board, and that's what he did. Such was his commitment. And he also had to make a change to the constitution to get her onto the board, and they did that at Collingwood. This was quickly followed by Port Adelaide Football Club, who through their membership elections elected Gavin Wanganeen to be their board member. So he's the first Indigenous board member across all the clubs to be elected by the membership, and the first former player, because all the other positions have gone to women. And the next one is Western Bulldogs, who are the only team at the moment that don't have any Indigenous board players, but they are following this path anyway because they know it's important. So Belinda Duarte, a fabulous Aboriginal woman from Victoria, has joined the board there, and I'm pretty confident of at least 2 clubs, but I won't out them just yet in case they take longer than I would like. But we're on the path. It is really important to have people in the decision-making roles. It's important to have diversity right through your organisation, and participation is the one that I think we often think of as the easy one to do. It's easy to invite some people from different backgrounds to come and join your group, to join your organisation, to employ people in your businesses. But to consider having people in your organisation who will be treated as the most senior part of what is equal is incredibly important, because that's where the ideas will come. That's where you will be challenged on assumptions. It's where you will have conversations that ask you to think differently. So for another example for us, last year I had the pleasure, even though it was a new challenge for me, I'm working on the first transgender policy for Australian rules football for the Women's League. I don't know how many of you realise just how quickly things are changing, but I know that we have transgender children playing children's football, and this is not going to go away. This is going to be an increasing part of our society, and it is against the law to discriminate against someone on the basis of their gender identity. And so we had to work through a long process of trying to work out how in a contact sport you deal with the idea of inclusion when you're talking about people who may have been born male but then identify as female, may or may not have had surgery, and under the law you've got to treat them equally. Now in sport, if there's considered to be an unfair competitive advantage, you do have a legal loophole to say, well, we're not going to allow you to play. The federal government, we're also working on a gender diversity in sport policy, and they kept telling me they were going to have theirs finished first, so I was sort of hanging back because I didn't want the AFL to come up with one that was in breach of the federal policy. Turns out we finished ours far before them, and they didn't deliver a policy in the end. They've delivered some guidelines because that's easier. We've got a policy, and we're just about to release our policy for gender diversity in community football level as well. So there's a whole range of things that sometimes aren't necessarily easy, aren't necessarily comfortable, but are a part of the world that we live in. And what I think about when I'm challenged about whether or not we should allow for some of these changes, I think about the world that I live in and the world that I want my daughter to live in, and what I teach my child about what is the right behaviour, about treating everyone with respect, about making sure that you don't make it harder for people to participate in something just because you're uncomfortable. I know that some of these concepts can be incredibly challenging, but they're very important to grapple with. And one of the things I know for certain is that if you don't talk about an issue or what you might consider a problem, you have no chance of solving it. So if something confronts you or something is difficult, it is always worth having a conversation. The other thing is there's always people out there who know what it's like to be discriminated against, who work tirelessly to try and educate the community to make the place more welcome, more affirming and more supportive of them and their difference. And so we all have an opportunity to engage with these groups in society who are more than willing to have the conversation with us, who are more than willing to not set up a sea of landmines waiting for you to step on it and make a mistake, but to help you work out how to have these conversations where you need to have them. Of course, we're not all going to be experts in every sort of field when it comes to all of the varieties of difference there are in our society. But the main thing is always to ask, listen and discuss in a respectful way. And if you can do those things, then there's no limit to the potential that you can have working collaboratively and inclusively with other people. If I had $1 for every time I was told from these, very earnest people who really care about our First People in Australia, we have so much to learn from your people. And I just think, well, when are you going to? Promptly go and ignore what they've just been told or learnt and not be conscious of the way that they engage with these concepts. And I agree, it's hard. My daughter is 11, almost 12, as she keeps reminding me, and for her, she's incredibly frustrated at my lack of fluency around climate change. She's absolutely obsessed about climate change. I care about it too, and I consider myself, to be as good as I can, considering all the carbon emissions based on all my flying around the country. I do my very best to recycle, all of those sorts of things, but nowhere near enough for my daughter. She's very concerned about my lack of knowledge on those issues. So I'm not here to say that I'm perfect in any way, but I know what it's like to be in a room. For those of you who watch Sesame Street growing up, you might remember the song, Which One of These Is Not Like the Other? Well, that would be me, every Monday morning at AFL exec meetings. But that's okay, because if I can be there, that means other people will be able to be there. And the warmth and the inclusion that I've experienced at the AFL, and a lot of people make judgments about the environment that it is. We know that if we want our game to continue to grow, that we must engage people from diverse backgrounds. The demographics of Australia are such that we will run out of people playing the game if people newly arrive to the country don't get opportunities. I mean, it's not an easy game to learn. For anyone who hasn't grown up with footy, I think when they do decide to engage with it, they don't understand the rules for a very long time, and please don't ask me to quote any in the question time because I will stuff that up for sure. But I'll give you Steve Hocking's number. He's head of football, and I'm sure he'll be delighted to hear from you. But we do have an opportunity always to think about how people who aren't represented in our game can be represented in our game, whether it's umpiring, whether it is playing, whether it is being a CEO of a football club, because we don't have any women in those roles. We've only got one woman as a club president, and that's Peggy O'Neill at Richmond. The other thing I'd like to say, as Peter's about to wind me up, when we're talking about diversity, my view is that when we're talking about gender and we're talking about women, there's nothing diverse about being a woman. We're more than half the world, actually. So when we're talking about gender, we should be talking about gender equality and allowing women to be fairly treated and to be included as equals. Certainly if we've come from organisations that have been very male dominated for a long time, then including women can feel like it is part of the diversity agenda. But there is nothing diverse about being a woman. We're over half the world. We give birth, and some of us do it without drugs, so we rock. So I would just like to remind us that including women is not a diversity agenda, that's a fairness and equality agenda. But including other people from different walks of life and different cultures, different faiths, that is people with different sexuality to what we might have, that's what we're really talking about in this day and age, and I wish you well with your work in building and growing this institution that you steward so well and for such a long time, so that you can continue to grow, because the world's going to continue to change. Thank you.
Torres, just put a bit of context around.
Sorry, go for it.
Just want to put a bit of context around my question. I started umpiring football in 1972 or 73. I started umpiring in 1972-73, and I've umpired many leagues: Diamond Valley, Victoria, Geelong League, CDFA, SAFA, SAFL, and on the Gold Coast. I was unfortunate enough a number of times to umpire Ghana Football Club, and I have never heard so much abuse and denigration in football in my life. That was when I was probably 21, 22 years old. Didn't really know what to do at that stage, because I was quite young and there were no rules around players being abused for being Aboriginal or whatever. So I'm just curious about what the league is doing now about pushing something down to the secondary and third level leagues. And just a follow-on question to that, what are you also doing about providing for young girls who are outside football clubs where there's no facilities for them to actually change and have what young men and children would accept, young boys would accept as change rooms wouldn't be acceptable or shouldn't be acceptable these days. The reality is that's what they do with every football match.
Sure, thank you. For those of you who couldn't hear, there were two questions. One, what are we doing about facilities for women in football, whether they be umpires or players, and the need for more facilities for women. And the first part of the question was about dealing with racial discrimination in the lower levels of football, so community football, and not just elite. In terms of the first question about what we're doing, we're currently doing a review of Rule 35, which is our vilification policy, and one of the terms of reference is community football. We know that elements of discrimination, regardless of what they're about, occur much more outside of elite football than they do in elite football, and that's where we need to concentrate a lot more of our time and effort around education, but also just making sure that people understand what the rule is and what they require, and trying to get consistency on the way that sanctions are put in place in relation to those cases. So we're doing that review as I speak, and hopefully that'll go to the AFL Commission at the end of this year. But community football is a focus because we're well aware that at those levels of football that discrimination still exists, and it happens on the field way too much, and it does impact people. It's easy to say that people should shake this off and grow thicker skin, but the reality is that it just doesn't work that way. There is real harm that occurs when people are treated in such a way, and we know that people leave the game because of it. So it's something that we're onto and doing some work on at the moment. In terms of facilities, there's a huge call to increase the number of facilities and change rooms for women and girls in football. I think back in 2014 there was something like, trying to think, about 193 women and girls playing football around Australia back in 2014. In 2018 it was nearly, it's over 900,000. So the growth of women and girls in our sport, putting huge demands on facilities that were only ever envisaged to be for boys and men. So there's a lot of fundraising that's taking place locally. Certainly the elite clubs, those with AFLW teams, are making all sorts of changes. One of the things that I've done in the past 18 months have gone around and let them know that because of transgender that they're going to have to do gender neutral facilities as well, because when they have those people in their teams, those sorts of people are going to be coming to the football to watch as well. And as you can imagine, toilets are a place where you sort of want to feel safe and you don't want to be confused about what's going on. So there's a whole range of things and improvements that need to be made, but this is all positive, this is all upside, because the way that football's taking off with women and girls around Australia is one of the most positive innovations that we've seen in our sport for a long time.
Time for one question. Lisa.
Thank you so much. How do we ensure that people don't just view this as being PC and being more and more, oh, we're just having to pile on the PC, that they actually realise this is serious stuff, and this is for any organisation, not just AFL?
Yeah, sure. So the question was, how do we avoid this just being about political correctness or being an accusation of political correctness? That there'll always be people that think it's politically correct only, and it doesn't really, it's not really relevant for them, and they shouldn't have to be concerned about it, and everyone should just find their own way through the world. What I like to say in response to that is that political correctness is for the dominant culture. It's not for me. I know how to treat people well, I know how to be respectful. It's to give you some guidelines and a bit of an idea about how not to tread on a landmine, because let's face it, we're asked to understand all sorts of new terminology that would be new to many of us, and unless you're operating in a world where this is part of your daily lived experience, you're just not going to know it. So political correctness, if that's what people want to call it, is just an opportunity to learn how to speak in ways that don't make judgments about people before you've met them. That's all it really is. We're talking about not using language that applies judgments unfairly. So if you can remember that's all it's really about, I think you'll find that it's actually quite helpful, and a lot of people are getting on that train, so don't miss it.
I think we've had an insight into a very powerful person in our community. One that I witnessed earlier this year when Tim Geneva introduced Tanya. He introduced her as the wife of a Port Adelaide supporter. And Tanya stood up, typical, her Welsh heritage took over, stood up and said, actually, my husband's football team doesn't define me. And I think you've seen an insight to that wonderful use of calmness and humour and respect that Tanya's shown us today, which keeps the dialogue going. And Martin O'Malley, a unionist who spoke to this club many years ago, said, you've got to keep talking. And so, Tanya, that's the big takeaway for many of us today, is we've got to keep talking. Thank you for playing in a few moments. To appreciate a certificate of appreciation for your time today, we're going to give you the certificate which acknowledges a donation's been made in your name to help eradicate polio, and we're almost there.
Thank you so much.